Hello and welcome back to Race Recap. My name is Jackson, and today on Race Recap we will be doing our first ever video on the IMSA WeatherTech series, and it will be their first race of the year of 2022 that happened just a few days ago, the Rolex 24 Hours of Daytona. And something special about this race is if you win your class, you will get a special Rolex watch. And I heard someone say, I don't know what's better, a win at the Rolex 24 or even a championship win. That just shows how awesome it is to win at Daytona, the 24-hour event. A few announcements before we get into the recap. First off, I just want to show the track description. This is the Daytona road course. If you want to pause the video, take a closer look at it. There's 12 turns in this. And the bus stop on the back straightaway, we'll have to slow down to some slower speeds to get through that. Also around the International Horseshoe, it's kind of like a whole 180-degree turn almost, trying to turn back around the other way. Another one of those near turn number 5. Then turn number 6, where a lot of action actually happened, is when you exit the infield back onto NASCAR turn 1. Also, before we begin, just another announcement real quick. I have no promise that I did get every single spin or off-track excursion that happened during the event, because I like to do that, but in a 24-hour event, it's almost impossible to get every little spin. And also, the driver name that's written down may not be the correct driver. Of course, it is someone who drove that car during the race, but before the spin, they could have just quickly switched out, and they might not have gotten it on the camera. So it's definitely someone that was on the team, but might not be during that wreck. So the race was, of course, 24 hours, and there was a lot to happen in it, so let's get right into it. So the first caution was a full course caution, actually, and it was a pretty big accident. The 18 car, an LMP2, Dwight Merriman, spun out, exiting turn number 6 again, and clipped the tire barrier wall with his nose, and actually kind of almost injured a track worker. Luckily, he was okay. He went flying backwards. He hit so hard, but he was okay. And Dwight Merriman's car was also okay, actually. It was able to continue on for most of the race before he was out later on with a gearbox issue. And then another LMP2 car, there was no caution. James McGuire spun around. There was no caution. GTD, Luis Perez Companc spun around. And then there was a pretty interesting wreck in turn number 1. A GTD car of Robert Lacorta in a Ferrari spun around, and he let off the gas when Frankie Montecalvo in a GTD car, the Lexus number 12, was trying to pass on the outside to get around this accident. So Montecalvo was clipped in the left rear and gave him some big damage in the rear of the car, and he also went spinning. Then there was no caution in GTD. John McGuire spun around. There was no caution when Hiroki Abe spun around in the LMP3 car. Then there was no caution. Lance Wisely spun around in an LMP3 car again. There was no caution. John McGuire spun around in a GTD entry. Then the second full course caution was brought out when the 34 of Kyle Washington had some heavy contact in the infield after getting off into the grass and going nose first into the tire wall, and he was actually the first DNF in the race in a GTD entry. And then right after that, the third full course caution happened. It was a pretty interesting wreck, and a big wreck at that too. It was around sunset, so sunset may have caused a factor into this race. Exiting turn number 6, you were blinded by the sun, so that's possibly what happened. The 39 Lamborghini actually had some contact, most likely with either Alex Ribieras or Kenny Habul in the 75. Both of those GTD cars, GTD Pro actually for Ribieras. But they both went spinning and were backwards on the track. A little scary there for them. Looked like they were going to get through it without a caution. But then the LMP3 car of Ayrton Ori came along, and he slid up his right rear, contacted the right side passenger door of the Ribieras car in the GTD Pro. So he went spinning off, and it hit, actually, Kenny Habul in the front, and that ended Habul's day and also Ribieras' day. But somehow Ori was able to continue. That LMP3 number 6 had plenty more troubles along the way. And then also there was a no caution when the number 10 of Will Stevens in a DPI car spun around. There was no caution. LMP3 Austin McCusker spun out. Fourth full course caution was a GTD car. Owen Trinkler spun around and made some contact with the outside wall. Then there was no caution when what looked to be Richard Westbrook in the number 5 DPI car spun around inside around the International Horseshoe, but it could have been actually an LMP2 car. Kind of hard to tell. It was the night hours. Then also there was no caution when Kyle Tilley spun around in the LMP2 entry. And actually we saw Kyle Tilley a few times last year, number 78 for BJ McLeod Motorsports in the Cup Series. And then there was no caution when Austin McCusker spun around again in an LMP3 car. Then there was no caution. Dirk Mueller spun around in a GTD Pro entry. Then the fifth full course caution was when Joe Miller in the LMP3 car had some contact, nosed it into the tire wall. Again, that was the number 6 car again, who was in that accident earlier. Then there was no caution when another LMP3 car had an issue. This time it was Dan Goldberg went spinning. Then Robert Foley Jr. spun around, and it was a 6th full course caution. Actually, it did bring out a full course yellow in a GTD car. There was no caution when Tristan Nunez spun around in the 31 car, DPI. Actually, the 31 was the champion last year with Felipe Nasser and Pippo Durrani, so Tristan Nunez new to the car this year. And then there was no caution when Corey Lewis spun around in the GTD car. Then there was no caution when Marcus Ericsson in DPI, the 02, was coming off of pit road, and he made some contact with Nunez again in the 31 DPI, and they both went spinning off into the grass at the exit of pit lane. Then the 7th full course caution was when John Miller spun around in GTD car. The 8th full course caution was Dennis Anderson getting off and into the wall in the LMP2 entry. There was no caution when Arisa Rario spun around in a GTD car. Then there was no caution when Jimmy Johnson, Jimmy Johnson in a DPI car. He was in there last year for a couple races, here again. And then number 48, he went spinning around. And then there was the 9th full course caution brought out when Dennis Anderson had more contact with the outside wall LMP2 car. And then the 10th full course caution was for a stopped LMP2 car. This time it was Josh Pearson. And then there was no caution in the GTD Pro car. Lisa Piccarillo spun around. Then the 11th full course caution was when Cameron Shields stopped on track in the LMP3 car. And the 12th caution was for another stop car. This time it was a GTD entry. Frankie Pereira stopped. And the 13th caution was actually a scary incident in the midnight hours. It was the number 7, Antonio DeQuain, in an LMP3 car. And the LMP3 car actually lit a blaze in the rear of the car where the engines held. Luckily, Antonio DeQuain was able to get out okay, but the car was toast literally and figuratively. And then there was no caution when Spencer Pumpelly spun around in a GTD car. The 14th full course caution was when Efren Castro spun around and made some contact with the outside wall in an LMP3 entry. There was no caution when Tristan Nunez spun around again in a DPI 31. And there was no caution when George Kurtz spun around in the LMP3 car. And then there was no caution Scott Huffaker spun around in the LMP2 entry. 15th full course caution was for another LMP2 car. This time James Allen stopped on track. There was no caution when Guy Smith spun around in another LMP2 entry. Then there was no caution Jimmy Johnson in the DPI 48 spun around again. And the 16th full course caution was when Lars Kern stopped in the LMP3 entry. Then there was no caution when what looked to be Bill Sweedler in the Lamborghini. Could have been a Ferrari actually, but it was still a GTD car, spun around on track in turn 1. Then the 17th and final 4-course yellow was brought out for Bill Sweedler in the GTD entry. He stopped on track. And then there was no caution on the last lap. It was a great battle between Matthew Jimine in the 9 car and Lawrence Vanthor and the 2, both of those GTD Pro cars, battling it out for the win in that class, for a Rolex watch as well. They were going side by side through the bus stop. Lawrence Vanthor stuck his nose in there. He went off into the grass and spun out, and Jimine went on to win the class on that white flag lap. And then the checkered flags in this race went to the 60, Elio Castroneves, Oliver Jarvis, Simon Pagenaud, and Tom Bloomquist in the DPI car. In LMP2, it was Pato O'Ward, F1 driver, Eric Lux, Devlon DeFrancisco, and Colton Herta winning in the 81 LMP2 entry. In LMP3, it was the 74 of Gar Robinson, Felipe Fraga, Kai Van Berlo, and Michael Cooper winning it. And GTD Pro, it was Matthew Jimine in that 9 car, along with Felipe Nasser, who won DPI in the 31 last season, and then Matt Campbell. And lastly, it was the 16 winning it in GTD, or just GTD. It was Ryan Hardwick, Zachary Robichon, Jan Helene, and Richard Leitz. Well, that's all for race recap. Come join us in a little over a month and a half for the IMSA series when they race next. It's 12 hours from Sebring.